Here's Joel Richardson, author of the new book, The Mideast Beast.
Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and I would like to discuss the subject of Ezekiel 38 and 39, most often referred to as the Battle of Gog of Magog. Now, in a previous discussion, we looked at a series of maps, some created by popular prophecy teachers, and then a handful created by more scholarly Bible atlases. And what we saw when we looked at and compared the distinctions between these two different sources is that most of the popular prophecy books placed Magog and this coming invasion of Israel in Russia. When we looked at the many scholarly Bible atlases, on the other hand, we saw that they universally placed Magog in Asia Minor or modern-day Turkey. Now, I want to discuss the reasoning and how the idea of how many come to the conclusion that in fact Magog is in Russia. And the reasoning is very simple. It first begins with a quote that comes from the Jewish historian Josephus, and he was a first century historian. He was a Jew who was a traitor to the Jews who went over to the Romans. And in his works he has this quote. He says, "Magog founded the Magogians, thus named after him, who by the Greeks are called Scythians." So because of this quote, many have concluded that Magog is a reference to the ancient Scythian peoples. And then, of course, when we look at where the Scythians dwelt, most often they are seen to be dwelling in modern-day Russia, as well as the Ukraine, all the way over to Central Asia. But there's a significant, in fact, a fatal flaw with this reasoning. So again, the idea is that Gog is from Magog, and then Magog is a reference to the Scythian peoples who lived in Russia. And again, the reasoning sounds very simple. The problem, however, is that modern biblical scholars use the interpretive method referred to as the historical grammatical method. Now, the historical grammatical method looks to any particular prophecy, and it looks at the original context of the prophecy. So the idea is to understand how Ezekiel himself would have understood the various names that were in his oracle. We're not concerned with how Josephus would have understood the terms. Josephus lived roughly 700 years after Ezekiel. So the question that the interpreter using the historical grammatical method is going to use is, how did Ezekiel understand these prophecies in his day? Where did the Magogians or the Scythians live in Ezekiel's day? Because the Scythians were a migratory people. They were constantly on the move. Now, when we look at history, it's replete with testimonies to the fact that during Ezekiel's day, the Scythian peoples lived in modern-day Turkey, ancient Asia Minor. In fact, there's a city on the western portion of Turkey referred to as Hierapolis, sometimes referred to as Scythopolis, and also referred to as Magog. So this was the region that was planted, this was the city that was planted by the Magogians or the Scythians. And again, this is in modern-day Turkey. So again, historical testimony is clear that the Scythians in Ezekiel's day dwelt in modern-day Turkey. Now, what many people do is, instead of using the historical grammatical method, instead they use something that I refer to as the bloodline lineage migration method, which is to say they try to trace the bloodline and the migration patterns of the ancient Magogians, who became the Scythians, and they try to trace them into the various nations where they live in modern times. Now, unfortunately, what many people do is they trace them up to the 1st century, when Josephus identified them as dwelling in the region north of the Black Sea, which is actually more like Ukraine rather than Russia. And then they stop there. So it's a very selective method where they're trying to use the bloodline lineage migration method of interpretation, but then they stop in the 1st century. The question is, why stop there? If we're gonna trace it all the way to the 1st century, 700 years removed from Ezekiel's prophecy, why not continue tracing it right up into modern times? Now, if we do that with regard to the various Japhetic peoples that are listed in Ezekiel's prophecy, so Gomer, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, and Togarmah, if we trace these people, we end up looking to the modern-day nations of the United States, of virtually all of Europe, of South Africa, of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, even Mexico. And if we're consistent in our usage of the bloodline lineage migration method, we have to include all of those nations. Now, I haven't seen a book called The Coming Mexican Invasion of Israel, but if these interpreters were consistent, they would be forced to, in fact, conclude that Mexico would be included in this coming invasion. Fortunately, modern Bible scholars are consistent in their testimony that Magog during Ezekiel's day was in Asia Minor or modern-day Turkey. In my new book, Mideast Beast, The Scriptural Case for an Islamic Antichrist, I walk the reader carefully through Ezekiel's oracle and bring them up to speed with modern-day scholarship. As Bereans, as those that are concerned with diligently studying the Scriptures and aligning our views with truth, as well as with modern scholarship as it aligns with truth, it's essential that we look afresh at Ezekiel's oracle because it is incredibly relevant and pressing for our times. The intensity and the urgency of the hour demands no less.
New York Times best-selling author Joel Richardson's newest release, The Mideast Beast of